This was part of a journey where I started to tell myself, well, what is the story I've told myself about this? Can I allow in other types of story? Can I allow in the story that actually there was some suffering, there was some difficulty in dukkha, which actually did really affect my life? It's so obvious that it would affect. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's lovely to be here, and hello to you all. It isn't my first ever time to Brixton Buddhist Centre, because when I was 1999, I became a mitra at the London Buddhist Centre, and I was very keen. I'd just been on a few retreats. I was ready to go, and I'd moved into the community there. And I think it was Maitreya Bandha who said, well, why don't we do some mitra projects at some point? And I decided for my project that I would start a new class somewhere in London that hadn't got a Buddhist meditation class going. So I chose Brixton, and I started a class at Brockwell Lido, and we were giving out flyers at the Tube. I remember I got this flyer that said, if you can breathe, you can meditate. It's quite a lively place, isn't it, Brixton Tube? Handing out these flyers. Somebody said, well, cows can breathe. I said, yeah, but they can't read, so don't worry. So we had 60 people turn up on the first night, and that actually was the first night of the Brockwell. And I think that Brockwell Lido course, there was a few of them, and then I think it became a thing at Brockwell Lido after that. So but I was going to say that one of the main reasons I chose Brockwell Lido, to be completely honest, was because my girlfriend lived pretty much opposite, and it allowed me a weekend visit away from the community, a weekday visit to my girlfriend. Anyway, that's all by the by. Good. So I want to talk to you about what do I want to talk about? It's not a book launch, but it kind of is a book launch. I've written a book, and I'm going to just draw out a couple of themes which I hope are of general interest. One of the lovely things about writing a memoir, or reading a memoir, I should say, is if it's well enough written, that is. And therein lies the rub. If it's well enough written, it actually invites you to you walk alongside someone else's life, but of course you're really thinking about your own life. It's a very personal, close communication, and as such, it's more than just about my life. Obviously, this book, if it was just a book about my life, it would be a rather sort of awful thing to inflict on anyone. But the memoir form has a real benefit to it, because it can allow you right inside a person's perspective, and through that, mysteriously, we start to see something else about that's of more general significance. And so there I was. I mentioned I was living at the London Buddhist Centre and very keen. So what I wanted to portray, generally in this book, was this wonderful thing that's happened to me and has happened to so many people I've known over the years, is where your heart and mind, your imagination comes alive through this thing we call Dharma, through coming into contact with the Sangha, through coming into contact maybe with people, in humble places like this place, like spaces that so many classes have started in. You go on retreat, you set up a shrine, and something magical happens, and it happened to me, and it's happened to so many people. And what I wanted to, when I started writing, I thought I really want to express my love and appreciation for all of this. Okay, so I started to write, but very quickly it became a little bit boring, a little bit like me talking about wonderful spiritual things and Dharma and things, and it sort of didn't really ring true. So I realized I had to write about something that was a bit more personal. So I started to write about being born with a disability, being born with one hand. And so I'm going to read just the first little bit of my book, just to give you a flavor of that. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that, growing up with one hand. You haven't nobody here's grown up with one hand, but hopefully you'll see something in that. And then talk a bit more about what kind of happens, when we've started to engage in spiritual practice. I'm going to talk personally, of course, but some of the conflicts that we can get into either within ourselves or with other people or with how we think about organisations and all of that kind of stuff. And I might say a few more other things as well, but let's just begin. No. Something was missing from the start. Dad bumped in. That's a very readerly thing to do, isn't it? Sort of put your leg up like that. Listen, children. Something was missing from the start. Dad bumped into another expectant father in the hospital corridor. "What news?" said the man. "We have a lovely baby boy," Dad replied, "but..." The midwife had introduced me to the world by thrusting my arm into Mum's face. "But he's not got his left hand." The man had some whiskey and poured them both a glass. Everyone was doing their bit. Dad's father, a farmer, broke from his daily rounds to shout some words down the phone to his son. "Never mind, we'll love him twice as much." 10 years earlier, the drug thalidomide had caused multiple limb deficiencies in thousands of children. So while Mum was sedated, I was examined for ailments more sinister than an absent hand. Every blemish was a harbinger of possible problems ahead. My mum's parents, Grandpa and Nana, were only allowed a quick look in. As they sat in the waiting room, a poem came to Grandpa, which he later wrote up on the nurse's attendance sheet. "His small grave face, but 12 hours here, bears mysteries stranger than the seas, in hieroglyphics more austere and older far than Ramesses." Setting events against a mythological backdrop would surely help. After 9 days, the doctors confirmed it was a congenital birth defect, which is a fancy way of saying they didn't know what caused it. My parents took me home, filled with overwhelming love and anxious sorrow. At the primary school where he was deputy head, Dad found himself repeating, "He's a lovely baby boy," but to a stream of colleagues expecting happy news. Mum was a classroom teacher at the same school. They didn't want the whole thing to be about the hand, but... As for me, I fitted right in. Newborn babies can't do much, however many hands they have. We lived in Banstead, Surrey, in a steep row of semi-detached houses with tight little porches and bay windows. Our cortina sat out front on the crazy paving. My awareness grew from the milky, undefined realm of supermarket trolley seat and playpen to include reference to a little hand which accompanied my journeys around the house. I expected to see it there, not realizing it was different or any less than a person might want, even though my sister popped out with 2. My little hand became part of the family, like a feature, like Dad's chin dimple, which I could poke through his beard, or Mum's long dark hair, which was hard to straighten, or our Labrador's big brown nose. In truth, little hand overstates things a bit. There are small nodes across where the knuckles would have been, but these are only fingers in the archaeological sense, like the worn-away remnants of an Iron Age fort. Stump would be more accurate, but who the hell wants a stump? So that's just a little taster. Who wants a stump? That's called Stumped. I started to write about the experience of being born with one hand. When I started to practice the Dharma, we did things like life stories. So, who here has done a life story? Has anybody told their life? It's more than half of it. It's a wonderful practice, and if you haven't done it, it's just a brilliant thing to do and then do again. And our life story kind of changes as we grow, doesn't it? And we get older, and even the events of our life take on different hues. But I remember the first time I was in my community there, I was 23 or whatever, and I did my life story, and I devoted about 30 seconds to the issue of having one hand. I knew it was a thing, but I didn't feel like I wanted to. I didn't feel like I needed to go into it. Actually, I thought, well, yep, born with one hand, doesn't really affect me that much. Let's move on. and I certainly didn't want to I didn't really want to delve into it, and I didn't want the implication that I was interested in Buddhism because they might have something to do with having a disability that had affected my life in some kind of way. I was more interested in. I was on the tube. I was on the train coming home only last week, and there was a little boy opposite me, and I I had my hands on the it was like a 4-seater thing, and I had my hands on the table, and I noticed a little boy. He must have been about 7, 8, and he was looking at me, and I immediately felt the same thing that I've always felt, which is that, it'd be better if I took my hand away and put it in my pocket, or just hid it under the table, or just got it out of the view. But I've learned to examine my responses. Now I'm 47 years old, and I thought, why am I doing that? Why am I still doing that? And it's definitely something to do with not wanting to be noticed, or primarily first noticed. Because of course, once you get to know people, people don't think about your hand all the time. But when you first meet, when people would first meet me, I want them to sort of see my hand and make that because I don't know what's going on in Tom's mind when he meets me first time. He might be feeling sympathetic, or also he might think it's a bit odd, it doesn't look too appealing. I know these reactions because I have these reactions actually towards people when I see they have physical, deformities or whatever. It's just a natural response. You have all kinds of responses, and in a way you can't even, you can start to do something about your responses, but they come very, they just come naturally, to use that phrase. But so I didn't want to be identified with my hand. I think this was always the way. So I didn't want my spiritual life to be identified, or my aspirations in the Dharma to be sort of identified with my hand in some way. So I only devoted about 30 seconds, and now I've written it into a very, it's not the whole book. The whole book is not about my hand. It's a paradox, okay? It's called The Sound of One Hand, which is a part of a koan called the sound of one. What is the sound of one hand clapping? It's not all about the hand, but in a part it's about the story I told myself about the hand and how that story has changed. So, what was the original story that my parents told me? A perfectly good story about my life, about you can just go out into the world, get on, do your best, you'll be fine. And we made all the kind of sort of adaptations. Classically, it was like eating becomes a thing when well, it's always a thing, isn't it? Eating. So you need cutlery, and how do you get things into your mouth? So I had a spoon, which was a fork, and a knife, which was useless because it wasn't either a knife or a spoon or a fork. It was just a sporky, knifey, crappy thing. And I remember you could sort of shepherd things to the edge of the plate, but you couldn't actually scoop them up. So in a way, there was practical problems, but they were not a big deal actually. You can get by with one hand, but it's not a big deal in many ways. Although obviously you're a parent, you're thinking it is, because you count your fingers, you count the toes of a newborn baby, and you worry and you think, well, this is going to be like, So yes, there are practical things, but it wasn't that. You can get on, and I adopted this attitude right the way through my life. It wasn't a big thing. I didn't really need to discuss it too much. I just needed to get on, be as good as the next person. Unconsciously, I felt like I could, looking back, I knew there was a deficit in my mind. I was one hand down on the whole thing, so I needed to sort of do twice as well in order to succeed. And I realised I had certain gifts that I could exploit. I was quite good at rugby. I was quite academic, so I exploited that. And just like all kids do, I guess, like we all do, we try to do our best to sort of get on in the world. But there was this underlying sense of silence. Nobody would mention my hand. Never. I went to hundreds of parties. No one ever mentioned it. But it was obvious, And I was maybe like, I could try to hide it subtly. But hiding your hand subtly doesn't work. It's just as obvious as any other. It doesn't work. And so all that sort of self-consciousness was there underneath. And in a way, I think this is what we all have something in our lives which causes that sort of sense of, I guess you could just say dukkha, if you were using a Buddhist term. There's that suffering around which, we have a certain set of learned responses and views and ideas, and it's quite unexplored. And this is something that I've then, I won't make this the whole discussion this evening, but like that theme. So, you know, I do remember a distinct moment when I was 29. I'd been practicing Dharma in the Buddhist center, living there for 6 years. I had been on umpteen retreats, and I saw a man get on the tube somewhere around the city of London. I was going to work, I was just going somewhere, and he had the same thing to me. He had a similar thing, very similar. And I immediately felt very uncomfortable. I thought, I don't want him to notice me. I don't want to have any conversation about any of this. I just didn't want, because actually, I didn't really meet very many people. In fact, I had not, at that point, ever had a conversation with anybody who had a similar thing to me. And yeah, I felt uncomfortable. And so I thought, I better investigate this. And I decided to go on a volunteers week where we volunteered with some children who, like, we did an activity week in the countryside with about 39 children, I think, and they all had one hand, or no hands, some of them, and all of the adult helpers did too. And so, I mean, this is something I describe in the book. I won't elaborate on it now, but this was part of a journey where I started to tell myself, well, what is the story I've told myself about this? Can I allow in other types of story? Can I allow in the story that actually there was some suffering, there was some difficulty in dukkha, which actually did really affect my life? It's so obvious that it would affect one's life, these things. But then in a way I was left with different stories. So, different, opening up to different stories. So and there's much more I could say about that, but I wanted to come on to something that, how shall I say it? So I was 22 when I first went on my first retreat. I remember it was in a school in Oxfordshire. It was a bigger room than this, and there was 100 or so people on it. I had been on one previous retreat. So some part of the backstory of my life is that my grandfather was, at one time, he was a Buddhist. He said he was a Buddhist. And he wrote a book on the philosophy and practice of meditation. And he had a little group. He lived in a place called Cheam. I don't know whether anyone knows Cheam. And he became a minor teacher in the suburbs of Cheam. Well, probably a major teacher in the suburbs of Cheam, actually. And he'd run classes and teach meditation. This was in the 1970s. After the war, he was interested in universalism. And actually, where Triratna began was in the 1960s. You know, it came out of that universal instinct that arose after the war, a sense that there must be there's a spiritual path opening up, which is kind of more universal. And Buddhism and Hinduism and these other Easternisms became very popular, Zen and the Vedanta and things. And my grandfather was really into that. At one point, he invited Sangha, who was the founder of Triratna, to come and talk at his house. This was in 1974, when he was. And I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know anything about this until I asked my grandmother. I was talking to my grandmother. I'd become a mitra, went down there for tea, and she said, "Oh, how is Sangha?" And I was Sangha. She called him Shita because she was embarrassed by calling him Sangha. That's the truth. She called him Sangha, and yeah, she took me up to my mother's old bedroom, and there was a picture of the London Buddhist Centre, and there were some old newsletters from FWA. There was, and Bhante had been to that house. They still lived there and given a talk. So part of my journey has involved this sense of what I really wanted to portray was this wonderful flaring of this thing we call Dharma in the whole of in the West. I wanted to try to portray that from a very personal point of view, using a kind of family story of that unfolding. You know, because I think, for me, as somebody who grew up in an era I was born in 1974. I grew up in the 80s, and I don't know whether it's different now. I don't know what's going on now, but religion was a dead duck. It was really laughed at, really, in my family. I mean, not maliciously. It was just thought absurd that anybody would be a Christian or have any kind of religious inclination. It was just something that had gone from history. You wouldn't have known about it in school. Religious education in school consisted in being extremely bored on a Tuesday afternoon and just not seeing any point in it whatsoever. That was a phase that we've done and dusted with in our history. And then, of course, I didn't know that anything was missing from my life, really, until I came across the Dharma, until I came across this presentation. I had my own sort of personal questions about my life, but it just seemed like the presentation that my culture was giving me this is very straightforward. You get a job, you do this, you do the other, and there was no sense of anything substantial missing. Okay, you can get more of that, you can be successful in various ways or not. But so I went on this retreat, and I think I've been practicing meditation for some time, and this sort of opening up of, I could only really describe it as the beginning of a sense of a changed universe, a changed cosmos, a changed whole sense of what life is. Of course, it didn't unfold in a flash. It wasn't something that just like, oh yeah, that's that. There was something that happened on that retreat, and in a way, I'd just known so many people. I'm sure, Maitrinara, you can relate to these sorts of experiences. We have this sort of opening, this crucial opening that happens to so many people, and it's particularly through going on retreat, through meditation. For me, it was just seeing the Sangha. It was seeing people who are really trying to practice and from the ground up. I went to Oxford, I studied law and philosophy, and it didn't seem to have any basis to it. It didn't seem that I couldn't understand what the point was, really. I studied philosophy as part of my law degree, not as a separate thing. But I moved into a community. I kept on meditating. I went on different retreats. And what happened, and I think this is so common, is that I thought things would just get incrementally better. I'd go on more and more retreats, and I would do more and more metabhavana. I would start glowing from the inside a little bit more. Things would become smoother. There were little edges that I needed to get knocked off, and okay, I had to have some little bits of difficulty, but actually it would get better, and it would be a path of improvement, and that in my mind. And then slowly, what started to emerge for me was something quite different, which was I didn't really want to do any of this. Actually, this Buddhist practice. I was living in a Buddhist community with 10 other really lovely men. It was above the London Buddhist Centre. I was connected to it. I thought it was all great. I didn't want to do any of it. I just thought, this isn't what I want to do with my life, really. But it is what I want to do with my life, really. I was in that kind of... It's great, this wonderful path has opened up. But I was 23, 24, and I had other questions in my life. There was other things that I felt drawn to. The mythology of romance, I say in the book, that it's been sort of hammered into me from a very early age, Prince Charming and all the tales you get as a child. And I really wanted that. And there I was living with some guys who were quite a bit older than me, who their lives to me looked kind of, in a way, a bit dreadful. Like they were going on longer and longer retreats. They didn't have much money. They didn't have any family. And, I found it sort of horrifying, actually, this idea that my Buddhist life was going to look like that in 20 years. And it threw me into this conflict, which was simply because even though I'd had some great sort of opening up that was real, I still wanted to earn more money. I was working for a pittance. I still wanted to do stuff. Still wanted a string of romances behind me that I hadn't really yet had enough. And there I was, in this community with these wonderful people. And I think this is actually quite common, although maybe it's more it's exaggerated if you're younger and you're getting involved in Dharma practice. It certainly, maybe that exaggerates it. But my conditioning, you know, my influences, my wishes were still with me, you know. So I think for a while, for quite a long time, even this continues in many respects, that there's kind of a conflict. There was a conflict, and people would say, you know, we have this thing in Triratna where you think, oh, we want to integrate our lives. We want to integrate it and become. It's fine, of course. You need, you know, we all need a bit of romance. We all need a bit of sex. We all need you want more money, and so it's sort of course we're all accepted that that's what people want. It's not, we're not crazy in Triratna. But you kind of I would interpret that as saying, well, I'm going to have to give up these things eventually. That's what you're saying, and I'm still not even sure about eventually. I just, you know, can we? And there was some really lovely people in my life, and I who were very, very kind to me and very patient with my doubts, which was I was a heavy doubter. I was because then I turned my doubt on myself. I sort of thought, well, maybe I'm no good at this spiritual practice. Maybe I'm no good at leading this life. They seem to be really great at it, but I am just really not cut out for this. There's something fundamentally wrong here. No doubt my attitude to at that time fairly unexplored attitude to my hand was part of it. Didn't like criticism. Anybody said things to me, I would get quite defensive. I'm quite good at poking back. If anybody pokes at me, watch out. I'm a lawyer. I like to be right, and I'm quite good at pretending that I am. So there were difficult times, and I can honestly say, after about 5 years of living in the community, I was pretty depressed. I wasn't depressed all the time, but rather than becoming this great, you know, creature on the way to enlightenment, I was sort of feeling really kind of rubbish and you know, in a kind of soup of self-doubt, doubt about the Dharma, doubt about Sangha, doubt about this, doubt about that. And it was quite tiresome. And I think what saved me was I started to doubt my doubt in the end. But I had to leave, and I left the community when I was 29, and I left the ordination process, which I've been in for 6 years, and I had to leave. Sort of, I left London. I went to live with my girlfriend in somewhere else in the country. Sometimes you have to leave, or sometimes you have to go and do something else. It's so easy to become very identified with the particular conditions that you're in. And, you know, I saw my leaving of the London Buddhist Centre as a kind of failure, actually. I thought, I've been given this wonderful thing. I still love the Dharma. I still, in a way, loved treatment. We called it FWBA then. I still loved it. Wasn't that in my heart of hearts, I thought, oh, the temptation was to say, oh, this is all just rubbish. These people are all killing themselves. There's plenty of that in Triratna if you want to find out people who've said things like that. And that is one of the things that I explore. It was part of the time that Triratna was heavily criticised in the press, in The Guardian in '97. That was when I first came along. I've seen 25 years of it, actually, in a way. So that's all in the mix. It wasn't just me, and then there were people that I looked up to who were often going through what I can describe as a kind of midlife crisis in the early 2000s, maybe 2005, 2008, that kind of time. The order had matured, and there were people who were practicing since they were from the age of 20, and they were now maybe 50. And they too, there was a lot of soul searching. Does this really work? You know, this is of course a facet of ordinary life, that whatever we do, we end up in our 40s asking if does this really work? Does this really deliver what I expected it was going to deliver? Many people in the order didn't have that midlife crisis as well. So I'm not talking about everybody, but there was some people who did, and I was aware of this. There was a crisis going on in the order. So anyway, leaving a community can be painful. But speaking personally, I had this. It was almost like I'd loaded up the ordination process that I was in. I'd loaded up London Buddhist Centre with all the meaning content of my life, and I couldn't imagine not living in the Buddhist Centre actually, and having a meaningful spiritual life. And it sounds a bit extreme, but there was a big fear that might be the case, and that I might not be able to, that I would have lost something by moving out. And yet many people, many good order members, actually one order member in particular, was very helpful in saying, you must think about these things, you must think what you conceive, what is unthinkable to you. You must think about, maybe, he didn't say what I should think, but I started to think, oh, I'm going to leave. Anyway, so I did leave. I won't talk about the story of what happened after that, because it's all in the book. Well, I will. I'll just say a little bit. I did go back, and I became a lawyer actually after that. So I kind of, like, my whole spiritual life went into big reverse gear change, and I was a miserable lawyer in the city for a couple of years, and it was a very interesting experience, because I'd vowed never to become a lawyer, because that was very unspiritual. So I ended up having to eat my words, because I realized I didn't want to go through life without any money and without any career, because I'd been working, been working in the Buddhist community most of my 20s. Things unfolded. And I think the kind of the resolution, in a way, which is not an easy thing, there's no easy resolution to this, but there's conflict, and I think I realized that I didn't have to resolve a lot of these conflicts eventually. That there were just different aspects going on. That's really badly put, so I won't go into that. Let me just pause. Does anybody have any questions at this point? We will break in a moment, but.
Have you had people actually asking you direct questions about your hand?
Yes.
Yeah. How to respond to that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I very rarely do people ask me direct questions about my hand, and I'm usually impressed when they do. I'm very happy when somebody says, "How did that happen?" I remember once, somebody did this once when I was in the bar at college. I said, "Oh, how did that happen?" And immediately a lot of my friends flocked round to hear the answer, because they were so embarrassed, because they had known me for about 2 years and they'd never even asked. And once you haven't asked for a while, it becomes a bit embarrassing to ask, doesn't it? Because you should have said it right at the beginning. But of course, it's also natural not to do that. When you first meet someone, I don't think there's a rule about that. If you're the kind of person who has that energy where you can just say that, that's you. If you're not, you're not. It doesn't really matter, actually. But I'm quite happy to be asked. If everybody was asking me, I'd have to review my answer, but that isn't going to happen. At one point in the book, I was in Nepal. I was traveling in Nepal, and I asked for ordination, and it was very culturally very different there. And I was in the street once. I was walking down the street, and a man came up to me, and he actually just picked up my hand like this, and he went, "I'm very sorry, very sorry." God, nobody's ever said that. Nobody's ever said, "Oh, wow, okay, fine." Yes, so it's interesting about these instinctive responses that we have. Like, we all have instinctive responses to other people on a whole range of different levels, what they look like, their race, their culture, their education, their background, origins, what they look like, etc. And I kind of think of that as not really an ethical question. It becomes ethical, of course, then, because we have to, if we do have responses that are just not helpful, then we have to start trying to do something different with our minds if we're causing suffering through what we're doing in some way. It is difficult, but you know, I remember that time I went on this course with these young people, children, and then we met the adults. The volunteers, we all went off to the pub, as you do when you're a volunteer on things. You go to the pub, and this was before the week. We didn't get drunk and then go back and look after the children. And no, I just felt so. I could see so many of my own responses to their disabilities were probably the same, even heightened responses that other people might have to their disabilities. Oh, that looks a bit. God, you get drawn in, don't you, to look at somebody if they've got something missing or something going on. You're just naturally drawn because it's a deviation in the overall pattern, and then you think, no, I shouldn't look. And you think, oh, yeah. I'll just have a sneaky look, you know. Do you do that sneaky look thing? And I know people are doing that sneaky look thing to me, but they're so good at it that I don't notice, because we're very good at having sneaky looks. It's this instinctual thing. And I don't mind that at all. Or I said that, but then I do mind, don't I? Because I kind of said that I kind of feel like I need to go, you know.
The reason I asked the question because I was in South Africa a couple of years ago, and I saw in a changing room a guy who had an amputated leg.
Yes.
I just turned to him and naturally, you know, it just came and was like, oh, what happened to you?
Yes.
And then we had this like the most amazing conversation. He had a shark attack apparently.
Shark attack. God, I wish I'd had one of them. That would be so good.
And then regardless of that, there's still surfing in the same area. But he
Yeah.
had a shark attack. That's where we met. We were in the changing room. We both kind of like surfing.
Yes.
And we just went out and sat down, had a kind of lunch together, and had this amazing conversation, like really open and like
great.
very wonderful conversation.
Great. So you're obviously that kind of person who can just say what's obvious.
In that moment, it just came naturally.
Absolutely. You don't have to. Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is getting a bit detailed, but I sometimes think that amputations are a bit easier to talk about because you there was once a leg there. You know, there was a leg there, and you want to hear what the story is. So it's often a good story, isn't it? Well, that is unusual, actually. I mean, you struck gold with that story about the shark. But a congenital birth defect is slightly different because they look slightly weirder. An amputation is a nice clean sort of cut, isn't it? But it's good. Yeah.
I don't know whether you're going to go into later as to how you came back to Triana.
Yes.
Is that something you're going to touch on?
Yeah, I could say a couple of things about that. I mean, I never, in my heart of hearts, really left Triratna. I never felt like there was a temptation to sort of dismiss it all, particularly when you've got national newspapers telling you that you're in a kind of funny organisation, and you know, it's very hard to not let that sort of get to your judgment about what is your own experience. I was speaking to someone recently who read my book, and he thought that it was quite, I mean, he was praising the book, I'll be honest, he was saying it was really good. But he was saying the tendency can be is to sort of either positively idealise the past, or, you know, like we could really overly positively idealise Triratna, and that happened a lot. And then the pendulum swung and a sort of negative idealisation took over. And even a kind of an outright sort of almost campaigning. And it's quite hard to sort of bring your own experience to bear on all of that, because we can get sort of, most people's experience of life isn't either of those. Life, of course, but Triratna is not either of those. It's very different. I've always found it to be just a wonderful, precious thing, which I always valued and continue to value. I know. I think once as I was talking about that movement, how I had to move away from identifying with a particular set of conditions. Like, if I didn't live at the London Buddhist Centre, if I wasn't doing this, then I think there was a process, and there often is a process of but it's a two-way thing. So it's like, it's not becoming detached in a sense of, oh, like, you know, this is just an organisation, and I just, you know, you get a bit out of it or you don't, and it's like it's a bit grubby and it's okay, like a lot of organisations are, where you come to that kind of a view. Like for me, it was a kind of holding on to what I love, holding on to what I value, and saying this is very precious. Of course, it's flawed. That's so obvious. It hardly needs to be said. It's an organisation, but I love it. There was something that was communicated to me by my teachers, my elders, these men and women who've been practicing for decades before I was around, and Sangha, what he taught them. There's something so precious being communicated, and that's of what's most important. And I guess you could say that's the arising of a kind of faith. It's not a faith that I'm going to sort all my personal issues out and get my exact story straight and kind of resolve all those difficult things in life about myself. But there was a sense of just allowing the this connection that I have with it, and kind of relaxing into the connection. Okay, I've got involved in this organisation. It's not organisation. I've got involved in this Buddhist Sangha, and that's I just can go with that flow. That's okay. And what you're talking about there, the attachment, I think, is where you just have an appropriate response to conventions. We know that we're not going for refuge to Triratna. We're not going for refuge to... We're going for refuge to the Buddha. We're seeing through the forms that we have, the forms of the retreats, the forms of the study, the forms of the friendships that we have, and the whole way that Triratna, maybe some of you know a lot about this, maybe some of you don't, but there's many ways of practice, and you're seeing through them to this thing that is beyond all of that, and that is essentially what it's really about. It's really much bigger than Triratna. It's even, you could say, bigger than the Buddhist tradition. I don't want to get too grand about how big it is, but so you're not bound by conventions. I love Triratna and I love the teachings, and I feel this gladness and gratitude for that. And after a while, I kind of realised I didn't have to resolve all the tensions. Many people told me this. My preceptor at Nagosha, who said, you just need to be bigger, not better. You don't need to be better. You just need to be bigger. You just need to embrace all these things and not try to tie up all the loose ends and resolve it all. Loads of people helped me, put up with me. You could say my wife probably more so than them most. And I just felt like I could come back and engage in a different way. Yeah.
Great, so I hope you enjoyed that Dharma talk. So if you did enjoy it, if you're enjoying our videos, I just want to ask you or encourage you to think about making a donation to the Brixton Buddhist Community. We're a UK charity that relies completely on your donations to run everything here. And if this was a meditation class, there'd be a donation bowl that you could just put in £10 at the end of the night to help support the activities. But as you're watching this online, I just want to ask you to think about making an online donation. If you've watched 4 or 5 videos this month, maybe you might want to think about giving £10. So there's a link in the description below where you can go to our website and make a donation. And if you want to keep giving and you don't want to worry about making that donation every month, well, you could just set up a standing order, a monthly standing order. That would be really, really helpful. I want to suggest something of the region of maybe £10 or £20 a month if you're able to do that, and that would be really, really helpful and help us keep producing videos like this one. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself.